The archive chamber was cold and dim, just the way Commander Zekthal preferred it these days since his old eyes could not handle bright lights anymore after all those years of service and battle across the stars in wars that seemed so distant. Now yet still haunted his every waking moment with memories that refused to fade no matter how much time passed. Scholar Ryath entered the chamber carrying her recording equipment with the eager energy of youth that Zekthal recognized from his own early days before the war, before humanity, before everything changed for the Vryn Confederation and its proud warrior traditions that had stood unchallenged for thousands of cycles until they met a species that rewrote every rule of warfare the Vryn thought they understood. Commander Zekthal, Ryath said with a respectful bow of her carapace, "Thank you for agreeing to this interview for the military archives." Zekthal waved one of his forearms in a gesture that was neither welcoming nor dismissive, but somewhere tired in between, as he settled his aging body into the interview chair that had been specially designed for Vryn physiology with its accommodations for their distinctive body structure and the weight of a lifetime spent in command. "You want to know about the humans," Zekthal said, not asking but stating because he knew why she had come, why they always came to him with their questions and their recording devices and their academic curiosity about a war they had not fought and could not truly understand. "Yes, Commander," Ryath replied as she activated her equipment, and the soft hum of recording technology filled the quiet space between them. "The younger generations know so little about the war, and the Council believes it is important to preserve firsthand accounts before old warriors like me die and take our warnings to the grave." Zekthal finished for her with a bitter rasp in his voice that came from too many years of shouting orders across battlefields and breathing recycled air in damaged ships, limping home from encounters that should have been victories, but somehow never. Where Ryath had the grace to look uncomfortable at his bluntness, but she did not deny it, because they both knew it was true, and that time was running short for the generation that had faced humanity in open warfare and lived to speak of. "Tell me what you know about humans," Zekthal said, leaning forward in his chair with all four eyes focused on the young scholar with an intensity that made her shift her weight nervously from one leg to another. "They are our trading partners now," Ryath began carefully, reciting what she had clearly learned from modern diplomatic briefings. "A peaceful species that values cooperation and cultural exchange with other civilizations across the known galaxy." Zekthal made a sound that might have been a laugh, but came out more like a cough that rattled in his chest cavity where old wounds still ached when the station's atmospheric pressure changed. "Peaceful," he repeated as if tasting the word and finding it inadequate. "Yes, they are peaceful now, but do you know why they are peaceful, Scholar Ryath?" She hesitated, clearly unsure if this was a rhetorical question or if he expected an answer. From her limited academic understanding of interstellar politics and treaty negotiations, because they chose to be peaceful. Zekthal continued without waiting for her response. "And that choice is what makes them more terrifying than any warrior race in the galaxy, including our own, because a choice can be unmade, and humans are very good at making hard choices when circumstances require it." Ryath activated her primary recording device and settled into her own chair across from the old commander. "Perhaps you should start at the beginning," she suggested. "When the Vryn first encountered humanity." Zekthal's carapace shifted in what might have been a shrug or might have been the physical manifestation of memories he would rather not revisit, but knew he must for the sake of those who came after and who needed to understand what their ancestors had learned at such terrible cost. "The beginning," he mused, looking past Ryath to the viewport behind her where stars glittered in the eternal darkness of space, indifferent to the small dramas of organic beings who fought and died and made peace among them. "The beginning was arrogance, Scholar. Our arrogance and our certainty that we understood warfare because we had conquered, 17 star systems, and subjugated 8 different species who now lived under Rin rule and Rin law. He paused to let that sink in because it was important that she understand the context. The mindset, the absolute confidence that had driven Rin expansion across this sector of the galaxy for generations before they encountered the humans. We were warriors, Zekthel continued, bred for combat, trained from hatching in the arts of war. Our entire culture built around the concept of strength through conquest and dominance through superior force applied swiftly and without mercy to any who opposed our expansion. Riot was taking notes now in addition to her recordings, her young mind trying to process the worldview of a generation that had seen the Confederation at the height of its military power. When our scouts first reported contact with humanity, we were pleased, Zekthel said, and there was something bitter in his voice, like the taste of defeat remembered across the years. Here was another species to add to our domain, another set of worlds to claim for the Confederation, another victory to celebrate. In the halls of our ancestors, but the humans were different. Ryath prompted when Zekthel fell silent for a moment, lost in memories of briefing rooms and tactical displays, and the faces of officers who had been so certain of quick victory. We did not know they were different at first, Zekthel corrected. We saw what we expected to see, which was a species that appeared soft and weak, compared to our own with their fragile bodies and short lifespans, and their scattered colonies that seemed poorly defended by our standards of military readiness. He shifted in his chair, and Rieth could hear the faint click of his exoskeleton adjusting to the movement. A sound that reminded her that this was not just a historian recounting facts, but a soldier who had lived through events that still caused him physical and mental pain. The first battle was at Proxima Station, Zekthel said, a human outpost on the edge of their territory that we selected as our initial target because it was isolated and lightly defended, and we wanted to make a statement about Rin power that would encourage quick surrender from the rest of their colonies. And you won that battle? Raya said, because this much was in the official records that she had studied before requesting this interview. Yes, we won, Zekthel agreed. We won easily, in fact, because the humans fought conventionally using tactics that were straightforward and predictable, and when they realized they could not hold the station, they retreated in good order, taking their wounded and their equipment with them like any sensible military force facing superior numbers. So what went wrong? Ryath asked, leaning forward with genuine curiosity, because the records from that period became increasingly confused and contradictory as the war progressed. Zekel fixed her with all 4 eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Ryath understand for the first time why this old commander was so respected and so feared by those who had served under him. Nothing went wrong at Proxima Station, Zekthel said slowly. That was the problem, scholar, because we did not realize until much later that the humans had not been trying to win that battle at all, but rather had been studying us and learning our tactics and documenting our weapons and our ship configurations and our command protocols while making it look like a conventional military engagement that we could understand and feel confident about. Earth felt a chill run through her body, despite the controlled temperature of the archive chamber. We celebrated our victory, Zekthel continued, and we prepared for the next battle confident that the human resistance would crumble once they understood the futility of opposing Vrin military might as so many other species had done before them. He paused and looked directly at Rieth with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. We thought we had won, Zekthal said quietly. We had no idea the war had not even truly begun. Rieth watched as Commander Zekthal accessed his personal archive files with movements that were slow and deliberate, like someone handling objects that might shatter or perhaps explode if treated carelessly, and she supposed that memories could be both fragile and dangerous depending on their content and the weight they carried. You want to understand humans, Zekthal said as tactical displays flickered to life, showing star maps and fleet positions from 15 cycles ago. Then you need to understand the siege of Garrison World Beta 7, because that was when we first realized we were not fighting the kind of war we thought we were fighting. The holographic display showed a fortified world bristling with defensive installations and orbital platforms that had been designed to withstand any conventional assault by enemy forces using standard siege tactics that the Vryn had perfected over centuries of conquest. Beta 7 was one of our strongest military installations, Zekthal explained, pointing to the display with one of his arms, while the other three rested on the arms of his chair. We had enough supplies to last a full cycle, enough ammunition to repel a fleet 10 times the size of what the humans could muster, and enough troops to mount effective counterattacks against any landing forces. Riot studied the tactical information, carefully noting the impressive defensive capabilities that the Vryn had assembled on this world that was meant to serve as an anchor point for their expansion into human territory. The human fleet arrived 3 months after Proxima Station. Zekthal continued, and we were ready for them with our guns charged and our fighters deployed and our commanders confident that we would destroy their fleet and send a message that would break human resistance across all their colonies. But that did not happen, Raya said, because the records showed that Beta 7 had fallen to human forces, though the details of how remained classified at levels above her. Security clearance. The human fleet was smaller than we expected, Zekthal said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he was still puzzled by this, even after all these years. Perhaps 40 ships against our garrison of 8 orbital platforms and 200 defensive satellites, plus the ground-based weapons that could reach into orbit. He manipulated the display to show the initial engagement, and Riot watched as was. The human fleet approached the world in what appeared to be a standard attack formation. We fired on them as they entered range, Zekthal said, and they returned fire but without any real commitment to pressing the attack, and after exchanging salvos for perhaps an hour, they withdrew to a position just outside our effective weapons range. A failed assault, Riot suggested. Trying to understand the tactical situation, that is what we thought. Zekthal agreed, and we expected them to either retreat entirely or to return with reinforcements for another attack, but instead they just stayed there at the edge of our range, doing nothing but watching and occasionally running scans of our defenses. Riot frowned, trying to understand what strategic purpose this could serve, because it did not match any siege tactics she had studied in her military history courses. Days passed. Zekthal continued, and the humans remained in position, maintaining their blockade, but making no move to attack, and our commanders began to grow frustrated because this passive behavior made no sense according to Vryn tactical doctrine, which emphasized aggressive action and decisive engagement. He changed the display to show the passage of time and the unchanging positions of the human fleet maintaining their patient vigil outside the range of Beta 7's formidable defenses. After a week, our garrison commander ordered a sortie, Zekthal said, launching fighters and light cruisers to break the blockade and drive the humans away from our world. And the humans repelled the attack, Raya said, reading ahead in the tactical summary that scrolled across the bottom of the display. They did more than repel it, Zekthal corrected. They destroyed our forces with minimal losses to their own fleet, using tactics that perfectly countered the strategies we had employed. And when the survivors limped back to Beta 7, the humans simply resumed their position and continued watching. Rai was beginning to understand the unsettling nature of this siege. That did not follow any conventional pattern. We tried different approaches, Zekthal said. Different formations, different ship types, different times of day and night. And every single time the humans adapted their response perfectly, as if they knew exactly what we were going to do before we did it. They were learning, Riot said, feeling a chill despite herself. They were learning, Zekthel confirmed, studying every sortie we launched and analyzing our tactics and building a complete picture of how Vrin forces operated in combat situations, and we were giving them all the information they needed because we were too frustrated and too arrogant to realize what they were doing. The display advanced through weeks and then months, showing the unchanging tactical situation as the human fleet maintained its blockade, and Beta 7 remained secure behind its defenses in what appeared to be a stalemate that neither side could break. After 4 months, supplies on Beta 7 began to run low. Zekthal said quietly, because Vrin warfare doctrine was based on swift conquest and decisive victory, and we had never needed to stockpile resources for extended sieges that lasted longer than a few weeks at most. Riot felt her breathing quicken as she realized the implications of what the commander was telling her. The humans knew, Zekthal said, and there was something like admiration mixed with the bitterness in his voice. They had studied our logistics and our supply requirements, and they had calculated exactly how long Beta 7 could hold out under siege conditions, and they had positioned their fleet to wait us out without needing to fire another shot. That is when you sent reinforcements, Riot said, remembering fragments of information from the historical records that had not been fully classified. The Confederation assembled a relief fleet, Zekthal confirmed, 20 warships loaded with supplies and fresh troops to break the blockade and resupply Beta 7 before the garrison was forced to consider surrender. He manipulated the display to show the arrival of the Vrin relief fleet from multiple approach vectors, designed to divide human attention and create opportunities for ships to break through to the planet. The humans were ready, Zekthal said simply, and the display showed what happened next with brutal clarity as the relief fleet encountered defensive positions that seemed tailored specifically to counter every approach the Vrin commanders had planned. They had prepared perfect responses for every possible route we could take. Zekthal continued, positioning their ships and setting up crossfire zones and establishing sensor networks that gave them complete awareness of our movements before we even entered combat range. Riot watched the tactical playback showing Vrin ships being methodically destroyed or disabled as they attempted to reach Beta 7 with the supplies that the garrison desperately needed. 17 of our 20 ships were destroyed or crippled, Zekthal said, and the 3 that escaped did so only because the humans let them go so they could carry word back to the Confederation about what had happened. And Beta 7? Riot asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Beta 7 surrendered 6 days later, Zekthal said, when their supplies reached critical levels and the garrison commander realized that no relief was coming, and that the humans would simply wait until starvation forced capitulation. He closed the tactical display and the archive chamber returned to its previous dimness, lit only by the ambient glow of distant stars through the Kamwaratos viewport. The humans never fired a shot during the final week, Zekthal said. They just maintained their blockade and waited with patience that we could not comprehend because Vrin warriors measured battles in hours and days, but humans measured them in opportunities and outcomes regardless of how long those outcomes took to achieve. Wraith was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had heard and trying to reconcile this account with everything she thought she knew about warfare and military strategy. They turned our strength into our weakness, Zekthal said, and his voice carried the weight of a lesson learned at terrible cost. We were warriors trained for swift, aggressive combat, and they used that against us by refusing to give us the kind of battle we knew how to fight. They fought to win the war, Riot said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. We fought to win battles, Zekthal agreed, and we could not see that those were not the same thing until it was too late, and Beta 7 had fallen without the humans needing to match our strength, or our courage, or our warrior traditions, because they had something we did not have. What was that? Riot, Askejekthal looked at her with all four eyes and spoke a single word that seemed to echo in the quiet chamber: strategy. The recording session had been going for several hours, and Rayeth noticed that Commander Zekthal seemed to be growing more agitated as they progressed through his memories of the war, his carapace shifting frequently and his forearms moving in unconscious patterns that she recognized as signs of stress in Vryn physiology from her studies of combat psychology. "Do you need to take a break, Commander?" Rayeth asked with genuine concern, because the old warrior looked tired in ways that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. "No," Zekthal said firmly. "If we stop now, I may not have the courage to continue, and there are things you must hear, things that the younger generation needs to understand about what humans are capable of when you push them into a corner or make them feel threatened." He accessed another file from his personal archives, and Rayeth saw his hands trembling slightly as he brought up the tactical data from what the display labeled as the Antares Nebula campaign. "This is harder for you to discuss." Rayeth observed, watching the commander's reaction to the information appearing on the holographic display. "Beta 7 was a defeat," Zekthal said. "But the Antares Nebula was something else, entirely something that still visits me in my sleep cycles. 15 years after the war ended, and makes me wake up checking the shadows in my quarters for movement that should not be there." Rayeth felt her own anxiety rising at the tone in the commander's voice, because she had never seen him show fear before, and the fact that he was showing it now suggested that what came next would be difficult to hear. "The Antares Nebula is a region of dense stellar gas and dust that interferes with sensors and communications." Zekthal began, gesturing to the tactical map showing the vast cloud formation that spanned several light years. "And our intelligence suggested that human supply convoys were using it as a route to move materials to their forward bases. So you sent ships to intercept them?" Rayeth said, following the logical progression of military operations. "We sent hunter-killer packs," Zekthal confirmed. 20 warships organized into 4 groups of 5 with orders to pursue and destroy any human vessels they encountered in the nebula, and to disrupt human supply lines that were keeping their resistance efforts operational. The display showed the Vryn ships entering the nebula from multiple approach vectors, designed to create a net that would catch any human ships trying to flee from their advance. "Our sensors detected a human convoy 3 days into the operation," Zekthal continued. 7 cargo ships with a light escort of perhaps 3 warships, and our commanders were pleased because this seemed like easy prey that would allow us to claim a quick victory. But it was a trap, Rayeth said, because she was learning to recognize the pattern of human tactical thinking. "We did not know it was a trap," Zekthal said, "because the human ships appeared to be damaged with energy signatures suggesting failing reactors and compromised hull integrity. And they fled deeper into the nebula when our ships approached, which was exactly what Vryn doctrine said enemy ships should do when faced with superior force." He paused, and Rayeth could see him gathering himself for what came next, like a soldier preparing to enter a combat zone that he knew would be dangerous. "Our ships pursued," Zekthal said, following standard hunter-killer protocols that had worked successfully in hundreds of previous engagements against other species, and the human ships stayed just ahead of us, limping along at speeds that suggested they could not escape, but were trying anyway. The tactical display showed the chase progressing deeper into the densest regions of the nebula, where sensor interference was strongest, and communication between Vryn ships became sporadic and unreliable. After 6 hours of pursuit, the human ships vanished from our sensors, Zekthal said, and our commanders assumed they had been destroyed or had suffered catastrophic systems failures that left them drifting dead in space. "They had not," Rayeth said, knowing there had to be more to the story. "They had gone silent," Zekthal corrected, powering down their systems to minimize their sensor signatures and waiting in the darkness of the nebula for what came next. He manipulated the display to show a timeline of the events that followed, and Rieth felt her breathing quicken as she read the incident reports from the Vryn ships. The attacks began 12 hours after the human convoy disappeared. Zekthil said quietly. The VCS Talon reported they had lost contact with one of their patrol craft, and when they went to investigate, they found the ship drifting with its crew dead in their bunks with throats cut and no indication of forced entry or any alarm being raised. Rieth felt cold despite the controlled temperature of the archive chamber. Over the next 2 days we lost 7 more ships. Zekthal continued. All of them found the same way, with crews killed silently in their quarters or at their duty stations, and no sign of the attackers or how they had boarded the vessels without triggering any security systems. The humans had boarded your ships, Rieth said, trying to understand how this was possible. The humans had been boarding our ships all along, Zekthil corrected, using stealth insertion pods that our sensors could not detect in the interference of the nebula, and attaching themselves to our hulls during the pursuit when we were focused on chasing what we thought was fleeing prey. The tactical display showed reconstructed data from recovered security footage, and Rieth watched as human soldiers in dark armor moved through Vryn ships like shadows, avoiding patrols and disabling security systems with practiced efficiency. They studied us first, Zekthal said, and there was something like horrified respect in his voice. Living in the maintenance shafts and service tunnels of our ships for days, learning our patrol patterns and our crew schedules and our security protocols before they struck. Rieth watched the footage showing humans moving through corridors with weapons that made no sound and using hand signals to coordinate their actions with the kind of precision that came from extensive training and practice. We Vryn have superior night vision compared to humans, Zekthil said. Our eyes are designed to function in low-light conditions that would leave humans nearly blind, so they should have been at a disadvantage, Rieth suggested. They use our advantage against us, Zekthil said, manipulating the lighting systems in our ships to create specific patterns of shadow and illumination that made us see movement where there was none and miss movement where there was. He brought up analysis reports from Vryn military psychologists who had studied the attack patterns and concluded that the humans had deliberately exploited Vryn perceptual psychology to make their soldiers see threats that were not real while missing real threats that were right in front of them. They did not just kill our crews, Zekthil continued. They terrorized them, first making sounds in the walls and leaving evidence that someone had been in locked rooms and sending messages over ship communication systems that should not have been accessible to outsiders. Rieth reviewed the psychological assessments of surviving Vryn crew members who reported experiencing paranoia and fear that made them unable to function effectively even after they had escaped from the nebula. Of the 20 ships that entered the Antares Nebula, only 3 made it out, Zekthil said, and those 3 were allowed to escape because the humans wanted survivors to carry word back to the Confederation about what had happened. This was psychological warfare, Rieth said, understanding the purpose behind the terror tactics. This was humans showing us that they could hunt us anywhere. Zekthil corrected that our strength and our technology and our military traditions meant nothing if they chose to fight from the shadows instead of standing in open battle, where we expected them to be. He closed the tactical display, and Rieth saw that his hands were no longer trembling, but had curled into fists that pressed against the arms of his chair. We had hunted other species across the galaxy, Zekthil said quietly. We were the predators who pursued fleeing prey, and we took pride in our ability to track and destroy those who ran from our might. He looked at Rieth with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. In the Antares Nebula, we learned what it felt like to be prey, Zekthil said, and we learned that humans could become predators more terrifying than anything the Vryn had ever faced, because they did not just hunt to kill, they hunted to teach lessons and to send messages and to break the will of those who oppose them. They're patient in ways we cannot comprehend. Zekthal added, "We measure battles in hours and days, but humans measure them in opportunities, and they will wait as long as necessary for the right opportunity to present itself." Raya sat in silence, absorbing what she had heard and trying to reconcile the image of peaceful human traders she knew from current diplomatic relations with the calculating hunters that the commander described from the war. "Do you understand now, scholar?" Zekthal asked. "Do you understand why the peace treaty was necessary, and why we can never allow another war with humanity to begin?" Raya nodded slowly, because she was beginning to understand, though the full implications would take much longer to process completely. Commander Zekthal stood from his chair with movements that spoke of old injuries and older pain. Walking to the viewport that looked out onto the stars were human and Vryn ships, now patrolled together in formations that would have been unthinkable 15 cycles ago, when the two species were locked in a war that neither side had truly expected. "What I am about to tell you," Zekthal said without turning from the viewport, "is classified at the highest levels of the Confederation military command structure, and the only reason I am authorized to discuss it with you is because the Council has decided that future generations must know the truth about what happened when we invaded Earth." Raya felt her pulse quicken at the mention of Earth, because everyone knew that something catastrophic had occurred during the attempted invasion of the human homeworld. But the details had been sealed in archives that only the highest-ranking officials could access. "You invaded their homeworld," Raya said, trying to imagine the scale of military operations that would be required to launch an assault on the capital world of an entire species. "The war was going poorly for the Confederation," Zekthal explained, still gazing at the stars as if he could see the past written in their light. "We had lost Beta 7 and suffered devastating casualties in the Antares Nebula and dozens of other engagements where humans had systematically dismantled our forces using tactics we could not counter." He turned from the viewport, and Raya saw that his expression was haunted by memories that clearly still caused him pain, even after all these years. The Confederation Council decided that the only way to end the war quickly was to strike at the heart of human civilization. Zekthal continued, "To invade Earth itself and force a surrender by threatening their homeworld and their civilian population." "How many ships?" Raya asked, though part of her did not want to know the answer. 300 warships, Zekthal said. "The largest fleet the Vryn Confederation had ever assembled in its entire history, representing nearly 70% of our total military capacity, with troops and equipment gathered from every garrison and outpost across Vryn space." Raya tried to comprehend the magnitude of such a force and what it must have looked like assembled in space, preparing for the invasion that was meant to end the war. "We believed it would be sufficient," Zekthal said. "Our intelligence suggested that Earth's orbital defenses had been weakened by our previous campaigns, and that the human fleet was scattered across multiple systems, trying to defend their colonies from Vryn attacks. But your intelligence was wrong," Raya suggested. "Our intelligence was exactly what the humans wanted us to believe," Zekthal corrected. "They had been feeding us false information through captured equipment and compromised communication channels, and they had deliberately positioned their forces to make us think Earth was vulnerable, when in fact they had been preparing for this exact scenario." He accessed his personal archive again and brought up tactical recordings from the invasion fleet showing Earth growing larger in view screens as hundreds of Vryn warships approached the blue and white world that was humanity's cradle. "The initial orbital bombardment was successful," Zekthal said, and there was shame in his voice. "We destroyed military installations and spaceports and defensive satellites, and we believed we had crippled Earth's ability to resist our ground forces." The recordings showed massive explosions blooming across the planet's surface as Vryn Weapons struck their targets with devastating effect. Our troop carriers landed in major population centers. Zekthale continued, deploying 50,000 Rin soldiers who were expected to secure the cities and force the human government to surrender within days. That did not happen, Raya said, because clearly the invasion had failed, though the specifics of how remained unclear to her. We had never encountered anything like what we found on Earth. Zekthale said quietly, every other species we had conquered had military forces that could be defeated and civilian populations that would surrender once their defenders were gone, but humans made no such distinction between soldier and civilian. He brought up combat footage from ground forces, and Ryath watched in growing horror as she saw what the Rin troops had faced. Every human was a potential combatant. Zekthal explained. The elderly, who should have been helpless, fought us with weapons they had hidden in their homes, and young humans, barely past childhood, used explosives and ambush tactics against our patrols. The footage showed Rin soldiers advancing through city streets, where buildings had been turned into fortified positions, and every window could hide a sniper, and every doorway could conceal a trap. The cities became death traps. Zekthal said. Every building was fortified and every street was a kill zone, and the humans used tactics we had never seen before: improvised explosives, hidden in vehicles and buried in roads. Psychological warfare that made our soldiers paranoid and unable to trust their own senses. Ryath watched as the footage showed of Rin Patrol following a human child who was crying and appeared to be lost, and when the patrol entered a building to help the child, the entire structure collapsed, burying the soldiers under tons of rubble. They used their own civilians as bait, Zekthal said. And before you judge them too harshly, you must understand that every human on Earth had volunteered for this, knowing they would likely die, but believing their sacrifice would help defend their homeworld. The recording showed other incidents where human civilians had led Rin forces into ambushes or had themselves become weapons by detonating explosives when Rin command centers were established in their buildings. We captured several human prisoners, Zekthal continued, and our intelligence officers interrogated them, trying to understand the human defensive strategy, and what we learned terrified us. What did you learn? Ryath asked, though she was not certain she wanted to know. The humans had protocols for resistance that went 47 levels deep, Zekthal said. Detailed plans for what to do if their military was defeated and their government was captured and their cities were occupied, and even if all those things happened, they had contingencies for continued resistance that would make occupation impossible. He brought up documents that had been translated from human languages, showing organizational charts and operational procedures for civilian resistance movements. Level 1 was military defense, Zekthal explained. Level 2 was guerrilla warfare by trained soldiers. Level 3 was civilian militia resistance, and it continued down through 47 distinct levels, each one designed to activate if the previous levels failed. How far did you get? Ryath asked. We reached level 19, Zekthal said, and by that point we had lost 30% of our ground forces, and our soldiers were suffering from psychological trauma, and we had to face the reality that we could occupy Earth's cities, but we could never truly control them. The footage showed Rin troops who looked exhausted and frightened, moving through rubble-strewn streets, where any shadow could hide an enemy and any sound could signal an attack. They fought us in the ruins of their own cities, Zekthal said, using the rubble we had created as cover and turning our own weapons against us when they could capture them, and they never stopped. They never surrendered. They never accepted defeat. Ryath saw in the recordings human fighters who were wounded and bleeding, still engaging Rin forces with whatever weapons they could find. We broke their armies, Zekthal said, and his voice was thick with emotion. We shattered their fleets and we bombed their cities to rubble. And still they fought, not because they thought they could win, but because surrender was simply not in their nature. He closed the tactical displays and turned to face Riot directly. "They have a saying from their history," Zechthel said. "A quote from one of their leaders during an ancient war on their own world. And when I learned of it, I finally understood what we were facing." "What was the saying?" Riath asked. "We will fight them on the beaches," Zechthal quoted. "We will fight them on the landing grounds. We will fight in the fields and in the streets. We will fight in the hills, and we will never surrender." He paused to let the words sink in. "We learned too late that there was no beach, no city, no cave where humans would not fight." Zechthel continued that their capacity for resistance was not limited by military capability or strategic position, but only by their willingness to continue, and that willingness appeared to have no bottom, no breaking point, no moment where they would accept defeat. Riath tried to imagine what it must have been like for Vryn commanders to realize that they could not win this invasion regardless of how much force they applied. "After 3 months of fighting on Earth, we had suffered 40,000 casualties," Zechthel said. "Nearly 80% of our invasion force was dead or wounded or psychologically unfit for duty, and we had accomplished nothing except proving that humans would rather die fighting than live under Vryn rule. So you withdrew." Riath said. "We fled," Zechthel corrected bluntly. "And the humans let us go because they had made their point, and because destroying our fleet would have meant continuing a war that had already cost both sides more than either could afford." He returned to his chair and sat down heavily, as if the weight of these memories was a physical burden. "The invasion of Earth was meant to be our greatest victory." Zechthel sighed. The archive chamber had grown darker as station night cycle approached, and the stars beyond the viewport seemed brighter against the black of space. Indifferent witnesses to the conversation between old warrior and young scholar that was drawing toward its conclusion after hours of recording testimony that would reshape how future generations of Vryn understood the war with humanity. It checked her recording equipment to ensure everything had been properly captured, because she knew that what Commander Zechthal had shared with her today was information that the Confederation had kept secret for good reason and might never be disclosed. Again, with such candor and detail, "You have been very generous with your time, Commander," Riath said. "And I know this has been difficult for you to revisit these memories." Zechthel waved away her concern with one hand while the others remained folded in his lap in a posture that suggested weariness but also a kind of relief, as if the act of sharing these stories had lifted some burden he had been carrying alone for too long. The war ended not long after the failed invasion of Earth, Zechthel said, picking up the narrative thread without prompting, as if he needed to finish the story now that he had started. "The Confederation Council met in emergency session to discuss our options, and the conclusion was inescapable. You could not win," Riath said, understanding the logic, even if the admission must have been devastating to a warrior culture that had never before failed to conquer an enemy it had engaged. "We could not win," Zechthel confirmed. "And more importantly, we realized that even if we somehow managed to achieve military victory, the cost would be the complete destruction of Vryn civilization, because we had already committed 70% of our military capacity to the war, and we were losing." He leaned back in his chair, and Riath could see the exhaustion in his posture and in the way his four eyes seemed to have difficulty focusing on any one point. The humans were fighting wars among themselves for their entire recorded history, Zechthel said. And this revelation struck Riath with almost physical force because it recontextualized everything she had heard today. "What do you mean?" she asked, needing clarification even though the implication was clear. "Human civilization has existed for approximately 10,000 of their years," Zechthel explained. And in that time, they have been at peace for perhaps a few hundred years total, and the rest of that span has been filled with wars between different human factions and nations and ideologies. He brought up historical data that Vrin intelligence had compiled about human civilization, showing timeline after timeline marked with conflicts ranging from small tribal disputes to global wars that had killed millions. They've been practicing warfare on each other since before they discovered fire. Zekthal continued, perfecting tactics and strategies and weapons in an endless cycle of conflict and innovation that made them better at war than any species in the known galaxy. Rieth stared at the data, trying to comprehend a civilization that had spent its entire existence fighting itself and somehow survived and even thrived through that constant warfare. We were their first interstellar war, Zekthal said. The first time they had fought against a non-human enemy, and they applied everything they had learned from 10,000 years of fighting each other to the problem of defeating us. No wonder you could not win, Rieth said quietly. We never had a chance. Zekthal agreed, because we were warriors who trained for combat, but humans were a species that had evolved through warfare. That had made war such a fundamental part of their civilization that even their entertainment and their sports and their children's games were based on competitive conflict. He closed the historical data, and the chamber returned to its previous dimness. The peace treaty was negotiated over 6 months, Zekthal said, and the terms were surprisingly generous considering how badly we had lost the war. The humans could have demanded reparations, Rieth suggested, or territorial concessions or limits on Vrin military capability. They demanded none of those things, Zekthal said. Instead, they proposed a mutual defense pact and trade agreements and cultural exchange programs designed to turn us from enemies into allies. Why would they do that? Rieth asked. After everything the Confederation had done, because humans understand strategic thinking in ways we do not, Zekthal explained. They recognized that a defeated and humiliated Vrin Confederation would be unstable and potentially dangerous. But a Vrin Confederation that was treated with respect and given opportunities for profitable peace would be a valuable partner. He stood again and walked to the viewport, looking out at the mixed patrols of human and Vrin ships that now protected this sector of space together. The peace treaty was not mercy, Zekthal said. It was a calculated, strategic decision to convert an enemy into an asset, and it worked. Because here we are 15 cycles later, and the Confederation has prospered more under peace with humanity than we ever did through conquest. Rieth joined him at the viewport, watching the ships move in their coordinated patterns that represented a level of cooperation that would have seemed impossible during the war. Do you think the peace will last? Rieth asked. That depends on us, Zekthal said. On whether we remember the lessons of the war and understand what humans are capable of if we ever make the mistake of threatening them again. He turned to face her directly, and Rhea saw in his 4 eyes an intensity that demanded her full attention. You asked me earlier if the Confederation should fear humanity, Zekthal said, and I want to answer that question clearly so there is no misunderstanding. Please do. Rieth said. We should not fear them, Zekthal said firmly. Fear leads to poor decisions and unnecessary conflict, and the humans have shown us that they prefer peace when it is possible. He paused and then continued. But we must respect them absolutely, Zekthal said. We must never forget what they are capable of, and we must never provoke them, and we must never ever make the mistake of assuming that because they seem peaceful they have forgotten how to make war. Rieth nodded, understanding the distinction he was making. Humans do not forget. Zekthal continued. They practice and they prepare. And they wait, and if you force them to fight, they will show you that the universe has never seen warriors quite like them, because they do not just fight to win battles, they fight to win wars, and they will use every advantage and every tactic, and every weapon at their disposal to achieve victory. He gestured to the ships outside the viewport. Those human vessels out there patrolling with our own. Zekthal said, every one of them is crewed by beings who come from a civilization that has perfected warfare over 10 millennia and who have chosen to use their capabilities for peace because that serves their interests better than war. But if war came again, Ryath said, if war came again, Zekthal said quietly, we would lose even faster than we did the first time, because now the humans know everything about us, and they have had 15 cycles to think about how they would fight us if they needed to. The weight of that statement hung in the air between them. I want you to include something specific in your historical record, Zekthal said, something that the Council may not approve of, but which needs to be said. What is that, Commander? Ryath asked. Humanity is currently at peace with the Confederation and with most other species in the galaxy, Zekthal said, and many young Vryn like yourself see them as friends and trading partners and cultural allies. He fixed her with his gaze. Never forget that those peaceful traders and cultural ambassadors come from the same species that fought us to a standstill and turned our own tactics against us and showed us what total war truly means, Zekthal said. Never forget that their willingness to be peaceful is a choice they make every day, and that choice can be unmade if circumstances require it. Ryath felt a chill run through her body, despite the controlled temperature. The most dangerous thing about humans, Zekthal continued, is not their weapons or their tactics or their strategic thinking, though all of those are formidable. What is it then? Ryath asked. The most dangerous thing about humans is that they understand violence so completely and intimately, from their long history of warfare, that they can choose when to use it and when to refrain from using it with perfect clarity about the consequences of both choices. Zekthal said. He turned back to the viewport. And they have chosen peace, Zekthal said. Not because they cannot make war, but because they understand that peace serves their long-term interests better, and that makes them wise in ways that the Vryn are still learning to appreciate. Ryath deactivated her recording equipment, knowing that the interview was complete and that she had gathered testimony that would change how her generation understood both the war and the peace that followed. Thank you, Commander, Ryath said, for your honesty and for trusting me with these memories. Use them wisely, Scholar, Zekthal said, and make sure future generations understand that humanity deserves our respect, not our fear, but respect that comes from understanding exactly what they are capable of when pushed to fight. Ryath gathered her equipment, preparing to leave, but she paused at the doorway and looked back at the old commander who remained at the viewport, staring out at the stars. Commander, she said, one final question if I may ask, Zekthal said without turning.